Excited to kick off today's session, moving beyond AI visibility from discovery to performance. I'm Charleen, founder of the agency. I'll be your host and moderator today. I'm joined by two special guests, Rahul and Josh from Noble, part of our GTM Fund community, diving into one of the hottest topics of the year, all things AI search. This year, there's been a lot of buzz around AI visibility, lots of players in the space helping brands understand what prompts they're showing up within the LLMs. But, at the agency with a lot of performance advertisers, what we care more about is what brands can actually do to optimize, i.e. the paid placements within these LLMs. And so today's conversation is really going to be more focused on the second piece of the equation, the action piece, understanding the value of a placement, how to actually optimize, and what it means to treat this as a performance channel. So super excited to dig in. Thank you both, Rahul and Josh, for joining us.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Of course. So to kick off our conversation, I would love to start with intros. Rahul, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everybody. My name is Rahul. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Noble. Prior to starting Noble, I was working in healthcare. I started my first healthcare company back in 2014. It's actually where I met Josh. We're in the same incubator together. My first company was in the pharmacy space. I was leading sales as the CEO and co-founder of that business. And it's how I started my career in enterprise sales. I've been in different growth stage healthcare startups since, but always in the sales capacity. And so one of the things that I'm excited about with where we are in the buying journey and what's happening with AEO is that, we've gone from this moment in time where search was just how you get information. But now we're transitioning where that search is not just how you get information, but it could also be the start to the actual transaction and purchase that's happening at the same time. So excited to have this conversation with you guys today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And Josh, kick it over to you.
Yeah, I'm Josh Budman, Rahul's co-founder, CTO of Noble. I focus on the product and engineering side of things. Similar background to Rahul, started a digital health company using AI and machine learning before it became really big. Did that company for 6 or 7 years. We got acquired in 2020, worked at a larger company for a bit, all in healthcare. Got a little bit tired of working at a bigger company and decided to jump ship with Rahul and start this new business. So we've been through a longish journey, but this definitely seems like a very exciting space and really an unmet need, which as a technologist, what motivates me is solving unmet needs.
Yeah. And I do love that you guys are solving a specific gap within the AI search landscape, which we'll dive in. So thank you guys for joining. And I'm Charleen, founder of the agency. Prior to building the agency, I spent 6 years at Google, scaled hundreds of companies, managed over $250 million in ads. So I really got that front row seat working across so many verticals, seeing how that's evolved over the years. That said, as much as I love Google, and yes, like our agency is Google certified, we also recognize the importance of AI and adapting quick. So super excited to learn alongside partners such as you as the space evolves to help our listeners and brands adapt quickly. Cool. All right. Just to kick things off and set a little bit of context, this year we've seen a real shift towards AI powered search. Consumers are starting to discover brands through LLMs, not just traditional search. And so for brands trying to make sense of the shift, how might they start to understand where and how they're showing up inside of these LLMs? And how is Noble approaching the AI search landscape? Rahul, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, happy to chat about this. In general, when you think about AI search, part of the reason that it's so exciting is that when you think about traditional search and all of your prospects are, effectively using Google today just to understand kind of what's out there and to kind of just research products, understand kind of how to solve their problems. We've gone from this world where it's like blue link searches, so you search a keyword and then Google kind of directs you to another website where you find that answer. With LLMs and kind of these quote unquote answer engines, the LLM is actually just answering your question right there. And so you're not navigating to other sites. The actual question is being answered for you in that prompt or in the answer that's delivered. And what's exciting about this is today it's very much focused on what is that answer. And for many brands, it's how to show up in that answer. From an LLM perspective, Google's AI overview is definitely the largest one. I think it shows up in over half of Google searches today, and definitely a lot of the commercially focused ones where it's focused on products. ChatGPT is the other big player in the space. Then you have Perplexity and Claude and Grok and others that are more long tail. But what's interesting about where we are today and where we see this going is that today it's purely information and discovery and research. I do think in the near future, and you're already seeing this with ChatGPT, partnering with Instacart at Walmart and Shopify, where they're already integrating the checkout directly into the LLM. And so we're going to have this experience very soon. And it definitely will get better where it starts with the search, you're doing research, but then you can also transact directly on the LLM. And for B2B companies, I imagine that there'll be a book a demo directly on the LLM in addition to actually having the checkout there. And so for a lot of consumers, it's all about how do you make that process easier? How do you get the information that you need? How do you move forward with that purchase and that transaction? And because search is so high intent, it's already where you're going to learn about products. So I think it makes sense to integrate that whole experience from a buyer perspective. We're very early in this. I think whatever ChatGPT does and is successful, I think Google will follow. Obviously, they don't want to like cannibalize their existing business. I think it's I think they're kind of waiting and seeing to see how well ChatGPT does on this, what the conversion rates are. But I think Google will be a fast follower, and they still have all the distribution in the space, and that's where most of the eyeballs are from a consumer perspective. So that's what I think is kind of exciting about where we are today and what this can turn into. So I think the emphasis that a lot of companies have had on their website, I think websites will still be important, but I think most of the traffic on those sites will be from bots scraping it versus most of the human traffic will probably be on the LLMs, and you're already starting to see that today. So that's kind of a quick overview of like where we are today and where I see things shifting over the next 5 years. Josh and Shar would love to get your feedback on that and then give a sense of like, well, what is the landscape around AEO? What are the types of companies out there? And how does Noble fit into that mix?
Yeah, I think the 2 points that you talked about in terms of how the industry is shifting, one, the bots piece, right? Historically, websites were made for humans to read, but as we've seen these AI agents, those are scanning these now websites, especially if you're coming from these LLMs. And then the second piece, which you touched on, and we're going to probably be diving into a little bit later, LLMs and ChatGPT potentially adding checkouts to their platform. It's not only going to be a platform where consumers discovering brands, right? It's going to be more like an e-commerce platform such as Amazon. So an entirely new performance channel. Josh, I'll also kick it off to you. Want to give you a chance to answer. And then also understanding where Noble fits within the AI landscape, because it's such a broadly used term. And I know you guys are solving for a specific challenge that is highly relevant for our listeners.
Yeah, definitely. And I always approach this a bit more from a technical or engineering perspective. The comparison between SEO or search results, pre-LLMs and post-release of LLMs and inclusion of LLMs. I think the big difference is that you get one real answer now, and in many cases, especially if people are stopping at the AI overview, that's fundamentally what they see. And so what fascinates me and what we're trying to work on is what is a valuable certain placement within that answer. Traditionally, it was pretty obvious. You showed up first in a result. You showed up above the fold in the case of an ad. You could optimize for a keyword. That was a pretty well-known channel. Now, I think it would be naive to think that the LLM companies are not going to have ads at some point. But now it's the big question that we try to answer is organically, what is really the value of a placement in a result? Like if you search best of, insert technical space, best CRM, best healthcare software, etc. What is the value of a certain placement within that answer? Does it pay to be the top bullet in the list? Does it pay to be in the first paragraph and none of your other competitors are there? So it fascinates me how we're going to start to allocate value to those organic results beyond just ads and paid spend. And I think nobody really knows what's happening there. And I think that's what we're looking into being really good at. And then I think what a lot of companies will start to realize they need to do.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to touch on a little bit. This year, there has been a lot of players around the AI visibility space, like helping brands understand what types of prompts they're showing or not showing in, which ones they might want to be part of. For Noble, I know you guys are touching on the second piece. So in terms of actionability, how can a brand actually think about optimizing within the LLMs? And then the second piece to that, you touched a little bit about like the value of a placement. Are there any signals that might help influence which placement or mention that the brands want to show up in?
Yeah, I think there's a decent amount of companies that are doing very well and raising a lot of money focused on on-site content. And there's no doubt that for bottom of funnel searches, on-site content is probably the most important. Like if you already know what you want to buy and you've limited your search and your prompts down to a comparison between two competitors in the space, I would consider that a bottom of funnel search. there's no doubt that what's on your website is going to be very, very key to determining what the LLMs are going to say about you. And that's where I think on-site content optimization comes into play. There's all sorts of debates around whether traditional SEO tactics stay true to form and will help, or if there's new tactics needed. I won't get into that for the purpose of this answer. What our focus on is as a business, and I think what a lot of companies will focus on is more top of funnel prompts. When someone is still exploring a specific area and they don't even know what tools they want, like we're talking higher than even middle of funnel. So for instance, if you're a tool that targets small businesses, someone searching small business software and figuring out that they need a content management system, that they need maybe a time tracking tool, that they need a billing tool and an HR tool. And how do you show up in those answers? I think that's where being offsite is going to be the key here, because it's really this aggregation of offsite sources that are talking not just your businesses, but businesses like you that are going to control the ultimate signal in the LLM. So offsite content is the single most important thing, and this has been studied by Ahrefs and SEMrush. Single most important thing for showing up in these top of funnel prompts. Then I think another thing that people will explore more, we're definitely going to explore more as a business, is how does a specific article contribute to what the LLMs will say about you? And without getting into too much detail, I think using LLMs are simply natural language models, just very deep ones. We can use traditional natural language metrics like the one I talk about a lot is Rouge score, ROUGE, that basically shows the overlap between what's in a source and what the LLMs are saying about you in response to a prompt. So if you can imagine a lot of overlap between a third-party source and the LLMs, I mean, that source is probably very important. That real estate is super important to getting mentioned and getting visible in the LLMs. So that's what we want to study. Nobody has really studied that space, and that's where we can start to allocate a value specific real estate and on the internet as it relates to LLM visibility.
Yeah, and I don't know if this might be helpful too, just because I'm familiar with the Noble platform. So just to take it back a little bit for our listeners, typically when you're trying to understand which types of prompts you want to show up for as a brand within the LLMs, there's a high level data that shows you these are the top keywords like Google, but prompts within LLMs. Josh, I think what you're trying to describe is within the prompt, sometimes it shows this is the specific media source that you need to show up for to show in that prompt, or this is a specific listicle that your brand needs to be in to show up for this prompt. And I think you talked a little bit about how to potentially weight the value of the listicle versus the other types of media sources. Are there any other signals that can help a brand determine which one to prioritize as an example?
A great question. And yeah, I think keywords are still important, but keywords are turning into prompts, especially if people are still searching Google in many ways the way they used to. But for some of these other large language models, you're asking a question and it's pretty content rich what you're entering. And so a brand will typically have a list of 10, 20 prompts, all feeding up to a specific topic area that they care about in terms of LLM visibility. So if you can imagine, if you run 20 prompts and a certain citation shows up 15, 20 times across those 20 prompts, you can probably bet that citation is extremely important to that business. Being in that specific citation, like you said, Shar, the result will show the articles that are being cited. If an article is being cited across 20 prompts and then you multiply that across multiple LLMs, that's another way to allocate value. And another way is, I don't think the LLMs themselves say that the priority order they show the citations in is meaningful, but I bet that is probably the order in which some of these algorithms are pulling content to drive the answer. A combination of how frequently is it cited across the prompts that are important to your business, aggregated with how high up in the citation results does a specific citation show, can be a surrogate for value to your business in terms of being mentioned in that citation. So beyond overlap between the words in the answer and the words in the citation, there's all sorts of signals. As we start to reverse engineer the space a bit more, we'll learn in terms of how valuable a specific citation is. That is my hypothesis, especially when it comes to organic visibility.
Awesome. Rahul, would you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Josh covered it well. I mean, at the end of the day, if you want to show up in these answers, you have to be mentioned in the sources that they're pulling from. And to discover what those sources are, like the LLMs do give you a good, kind of glimpse of like, well, for this answer here, the sources we're pulling from, but then also tracking that across LLMs and how often these sources are showing up for the prompts that people care about, like that'll give you a good sense of what sources matter. And a lot of the visibility tools can do at least that much. And so that is commodity at this point where it's pretty easy to access those types of insights.
Amazing. And then, moving on to the next question, which Josh talked a little bit about the SEO to GEO evolution. So, historically, this has typically sat with teams. But as we start to see paid placement and controllable exposure inside of the LLMs, this begins to look a lot more like a performance channel. So Josh or Rahul, I'm curious, how should marketers think about AI discovery as it moves from this idea of earn to managed? And what role even might the paid media team start to play in that?
Yeah, I can take a first crack at this. And I think where we are right now, the attribution isn't quite there for somebody who's on the the earned media team or the paid team to look at if you're showing up in the answer, then how does that impact like the checkout or the actual purchase? For an ad today, the attribution is great. You can see who clicks on the ad and then who goes to your website and checks out. For Google's AI overview, for example, somebody could see your brand showing up in the AI overview, but then you have no idea if they're clicking in the AI overview to get to your website. You don't know if they're opening up a separate tab and then clicking on essentially searching for your brand directly. And so the attribution isn't quite there today. I imagine in the very near future, especially as there is a checkout embedded in the LLM, the LLMs like have every incentive in the world to make sure that that attribution is much better and much cleaner from search and like research being done to the checkout or whatever that transaction is. And at that point, I actually think what you're going to see is this convergence of traditional SEO and paid ad spend kind of get lumped together. Because at the end of the day, whether you're paying for an ad in the search or you're organically showing up, if people can check out and you can essentially track that, I think a lot of people who are spending money on ads might find it actually more efficient to figure out, well, how do I just show up in the answer itself? And unlike traditional blue link search, you can influence the answers a lot faster. You're not waiting for these quarterly updates. These LLMs will essentially update many times in real time as well. So I think today where we stand, I think there is a separation between SEO and paid spend teams. But I think if we have this conversation a year from now, I think they're eventually going to converge into one.
Yeah. And I think there's two angles for paid, which I think you touched a little bit on. One is actually paying for ads to show within the LLMs, which is probably more in line with as ChatGPT becomes more of an e-commerce platform, checkouts, et cetera. And I think the other angle, which is actually happening now, this idea of a paid placement within LLMs, what I was alluding to earlier, the first half of the equation was understanding which prompts to show for, just knowing and having that information. But the second piece now is actually being able to pay to show up in those placements. Can you speak a little bit to that piece? Because I think that's actually something that advertisers can actually take action on today.
Yeah, and that's the bread and butter of what Noble does is we're effectively helping brands get placed in the sources that LLMs are citing for the prompts they care about. So what we've done is we've built essentially the software platform that will run all the prompts that you care about and want to show up in. We'll identify what those sources are that Josh was talking about earlier in terms of like, well, what are these high value sources? Where are the LLMs actually, pulling their answers from? And then we've built essentially a software agent that will go out and essentially reach out to every publisher or author to try to get you mentioned in their sources. So what Noble will do is we'll essentially identify the sources, we'll do the outreach, we'll do the negotiation, and then the payment on your behalf to get your brand mentioned in those sources. And it's not just, the brand itself, it'll be like a full, few sentences about what you guys do. And we will look to incorporate the current positioning or messaging on your website. And then we'll also look to answer the search prompt altogether as we add copy into that source. And so ultimately, our goal here is that if we know what sources are that matter, how can we actually get your brand mentioned in those sources and as a result then showing up in the answer that your prospects are reading? And we're already seeing it today with our current clients where their overall visibility is increasing because we're getting them mentioned in the sources that these LLMs are citing for the prompts they care about.
Yeah. And for our listeners, I want to reinforce like how cool this is, because even just a few months ago in like we're talking with our clients, that piece was pretty manual in the sense where we had to, work with the PR agency, ask them, which sources we wanted to potentially place in, how much it cost. Like it was a very manual and piecemeal process. I think it's actually really cool that you guys are solving for this part of the equation where you're integrating with other AI visibility tools such as Crunch and, the LLMs itself to make that whole process to be paid within these placements very seamless.
Yeah, no, we're super excited about it. And it's also, at a point where software can do this. Like if we were having this conversation a year or two ago, we would have to have like an army of people doing this manually, which is, also very expensive. But with kind of the software and kind of what agents can do, it's something that's very scalable and affordable for all companies.
Yeah. Okay. We talked a little bit about like AI visibility, the optimization pieces around that, and how LLMs are actually evolving into more of a performance channel, adding transactional pieces to the platform. Josh, Rahul, do you guys have any pieces of advice for our listeners in terms of what they can do to help prep for 2026?
I think the big thing is to be, again, as an engineer, it's all about data. I think if I were a brand consuming this data, I'd figure out, basically, once we can figure out the reason, that paid spend is not super prevalent is because I don't think anybody knows the value of being shown in an answer in a certain way, since we can't track it all the way through the funnel, right? Like these are not, a lot of these are zero-click interactions. That's pretty well studied right now, where people are seeing something and then visiting the website behind the scenes. So I know that the collective intelligence of this space will figure out how to attribute some of this stuff. And I think just staying on the forefront of that attribution will allow you to be very judicious about the way you approach this problem. And so, I think these visibility tools are great. I think on-site optimization is great. I think what Noble is doing is great. But I think if I were a brand, it's just figuring out that correlation between the very top of the funnel, like what prompts are important to us, all the way down to identifying the importance of a prompt and then getting into like whatever metric you care about, conversions, free trials, etc. So I think as a brand, trying to figure out how to close that loop is the single most important thing in 2026, and basically just requires staying on the forefront and understanding which data is good, which data is less useful, and aggregating the good ones.
Awesome. Thank you. And Rahul?
Yeah, just to add to that is, we're in a special moment in time. It's almost as if you could do SEO in the early 2000s when Google was just emerging, you would have a huge leg up on the rest of the industry. And that's the moment in time we are in right now with LLMs, where if you're actually willing to be proactive, take a risk, test out these new tools, I think it could have a much bigger impact that it could potentially have in a few years when this becomes the norm. So there's so much right now around like, just like testing different solutions and seeing what works and what really doesn't work. But I think just being proactive right now could have outsized impact for a company.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think, if I were to summarize the conversation in terms of how the industry is shifting from a marketing perspective, the funnel really is collapsing. It's this zero-click feature that we're talking about, where people are searching for the answer and then they get the answer and they just go direct. And so, number one, it's like for our listeners, just be aware of how this is changing and get ahead of the curve. The second thing is very similar when we think about high intent and Google. When we think about keywords, it's actually pretty similar when you go from Google into these LLMs. There's still this idea of brand, non-brand, and competitors. Instead of keywords, it's more of a prompt situation where you can see a lot of that data that Josh is talking about within these AI visibility tools. And then moving into more of the paid piece, because we are typically growth and paid teams here, two angles. As these platforms add capabilities for checkout, there's going to be more of that like paid advertisement capability within the platforms where it's going to become a performance channel. And then the second piece, which is something that brands can actually start to do today, which is the paid placements within LLMs, right? Something that Noble is at least solving for. So I think it's pretty cool. And yeah, just super excited to see how this space continues to evolve into next year. Anything else you guys want to add?
No, I think you covered it. Thanks again for having us. This is an awesome conversation.
Amazing. Yeah. Where can our listeners find you guys?
Yeah, so you can go to that'snoble.com to learn more, or you could just email us at team@that'snoble.com if you want to get in touch.
Awesome. Okay, well, that concludes our session today. Thank you, Josh and Rahul, both for joining